When he was president, Abraham Lincoln fought the Civil War because he wanted to maintain the Union. He was not an abolitionist at the beginning of the war. However, at the conclusion of the war, it was clear and evident that slavery had to be abolished. Reconstruction was a time period that took place between 1865 to 1877. The reason the time period is called Reconstruction is because there's a lot that needs to be reconstructed in the South. For example, bridges, roads, buildings, all of that needs to be repaired after the war. Also, African Americans need to get their civil rights. Finally, the Confederate States need to now become back a part of the United States. So the American government had to go to work and work fast. We need to distinguish between presidential or more lenient Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction, which was harsh on the South. At first, all Lincoln wanted was a 10% plan. That meant when 10% of the citizens of the Confederacy took an oath and pledged their sincerity toward the Constitution, that state could come back in the Union. Congress didn't like that. They thought it was too lenient, and they supported the Wade-Davis bill, which meant a majority of citizens had to take the oath. Lincoln pocket vetoed it. You need to understand 3 amendments that were passed and ratified during Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment protected citizenship rights, as well as equal protection under the law rights. That meant that no 2 races could be treated differently under the law. The 15th Amendment protected universal male suffrage or voting rights. President Johnson was vetoing legislation. For example, the Freedmen's Bureau needed more money. He vetoed that plan. The Freedmen's Bureau helped African Americans get education as well as training for possible jobs after slavery. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Act. That was supposed to give more rights to African Americans in terms of equal rights that were needed before the 14th Amendment was ratified. However, Congress would get back at Johnson. He would become the first president to ever be impeached. He was not removed by the Senate from office. After 1867, it became apparent that radical Reconstruction would become the new norm. There were 2 leaders that you need to know about. One was Charles Sumner and the other was Thaddeus Stevens. They supported the Reconstruction Act of 1867. That divided the South into 5 military districts, and that meant that the Army would come back into the South for the first time since the Civil War to enforce Reconstruction law. They made sure that states ratified the important 14th Amendment. In addition, they made sure that African Americans would be involved in the writing of state constitutions. This was very unpopular and led to backlash in the South. It led to the rise of a terrorist organization known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. They went around terrorizing those who supported Reconstruction as well as freed slaves. Also unpopular in the South was who was running the government. We had carpetbaggers who were Northerners who went south for political and economic gain. In addition, there were scalawags who were Republicans in the South. Remember, much of the South voted Democrat for decades. Reconstruction would ultimately end in 1877 because of a disputed presidential election. In the election of 1876, Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, was ahead on both electoral and popular votes. However, there were some electoral votes that were in dispute. It turned out that all of those votes went to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats were distraught. However, they got an end to Reconstruction as a compromise. However, after Reconstruction, you get a time period known as Home Rule. This is where African Americans lost all of those precious rights. This is where you have Jim Crow laws. That meant that separate but equal became the law of the land. That's where African Americans would not be equal in terms of schools and beaches and even bathrooms and water fountains in hotels. The case of Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 agreed that separate but equal was indeed constitutional. Regarding voting rights, blacks couldn't really vote because they would have to take a literacy test, or there would be violence at the polls. In addition, there were poll taxes. As far as whites were concerned who couldn't pass a literacy test, they could vote if their grandfather voted in the election of 1860, and we call those grandfather clauses. As far as economic rights, well, that wasn't too good either for former slaves. Many of them became sharecroppers. That's when you work for a share of the crop or you work as a tenant on a farm. That led to immense debt that the former slaves couldn't get out of for years. It can be said that African Americans had more rights in the 1870s than they did in the 1920s and 30s. During this time period, there were plans to have the South become more industrial. This is called the New South. However, only Atlanta really became as industrial as many of the northern cities or cities in the Midwest, such as Chicago. There are those who say Reconstruction was a success, and there are those who say that Reconstruction was a failure. However, Reconstruction can be seen as an early prelude to what would become the Civil Rights era. However, that would not take place for almost 100 years.